Welcome to Inside Brussels, the European Conservatives monthly news show. Only a few weeks left until the 2024 EU elections, when over 400 million people will have a chance to have their voices heard about what kind of Europe they would like to see in the next 5 years. From mass migration threatening our way of life and the Green Deal destroying our farmers and industry, to the rule of law and controversial treaty change proposals, there's much to consider before you cast your ballots in June, issues that we already discussed in the previous episodes, as well as our new election guide, The Stakes, which is already available in our online webshop. Each and every one of these issues come down to one question: who rules? As Mick Hume, our senior columnist, said at Netcom Brussels, the real question we have to ask ourselves is who is to decide the future of Europe? Is it the centralized oligarchy in Brussels or the sovereign nations of Europe? EU policies are shaping everything around us, and Brussels has been turning into Europe's primary political battlefield. The Parliament's role in shaping our policies is not insignificant. With MEPs having a say in every decision that comes out of Brussels, it does matter who represents you in the European Parliament. In 3 weeks, we'll have the opportunity to put demos, the people, back in democracy again. But for that to happen, each and every one of us have a role to play. Use your vote and vote for the parties and candidates who will stand for national sovereignty and democracy. On the 9th of June, we'll be reporting live from Brussels as the results are coming in, with our journalists on the ground and having experts in the studio to keep you up to date as the battle for the future of Europe unfolds. In this episode, we'll take a look at the state of the campaign, both at the EU level as well as in certain member states, focusing on conservative parties and the challenges they face. My first guest in the studio is James Holland, political advisor and commentator. Thank you so much, James, for joining me in the studio.
My pleasure.
With only a couple of weeks left until the 2024 EU elections, how would you evaluate the Conservatives group's campaign so far? Do you feel that the ECR and the ID together or individually were able to ride the Eurosceptic wave as much as they could have?
I think they're doing well. I think that what you're seeing is the continuous rise of the Eurosceptic size in the European institutions. I started working in the European Parliament 20 years ago. And at that point, really, that fringe of Eurosceptic was very small. At that point, the Conservatives were still sitting with the EPP. And we saw that split, in 2009 already create the first ECR group. Over time, with every European election that's come, that size has grown. And now I think we're going to see the biggest ever. Now, let's, of course, wait to see, because the polls change very quickly. These are also European national campaigns, mostly now. Once the real work of the European election starts at the national level, you see that parties can jump and drop very quickly, depending on which way those national debates go. But I think that they're in a very good position. I think clearly there is a lot of frustration with the European Union over the last 5 years, and you can go back even further. So I think that the two groups are going to do well. Whether that means that there's going to be a cohesive bloc, no, I don't think that will happen. I don't think we're at that stage. I think there's a lot of ideological and strategic differences between the different parties. But it's clear that when the result comes out on the 9th of June, we'll be able to have a better idea of exactly how much influence those different political groups will have on the processes, and especially what happens in the two buildings that people can see here. We've got the Council there and the Commission there. When those roles are assigned after the European elections, I think for the first time, the ECR, with potentially some of the votes from ID, will be able to change things.
It's clear that Conservatives will be a much bigger force in the Parliament after the election, possibly being the third and fourth largest groups, but still far from having a majority without the EPP. So what can this stronger mandate realistically enable them to achieve?
Well, in the end, it comes down to votes in the Council and in the European Parliament. Whichever person is put forward as the future Commission President will have to seek the support of as big a group of MEPs and member states as they possibly can. So what we'll see is that the size of the ECR, the size of ID, the size of the independents also, the size of the independents within the parliament will be significant, and where those parties fall will also be important. So there will be the chance to influence who will be president of the commission potentially, also who will get the key roles of vice presidents within the commission. The EAS, which is just there, is also a key institution which has normally been held by the socialists since the EPP has controlled the commission. Again, it'll be very fine balance of where those numbers will fall. But it's clear that as you start to get to close to 200 MEPs who reject the Commission's desire for ever greater union, ever deeper integration, that will start to play out in all the different institutions. And those forces on the right in the European institutions will have to try to make sure they are organized. They'll have to put aside the differences to create a cohesive bloc at that key moment after the European elections. It's difficult to do. There's a lot of history between these parties. There's a lot of histories often between two parties within one country who are going to have to sit and potentially do deals with each other, which is not easy. But I think that, as I say, it's going to be very interesting to see how these things fall.
We're talking about the European parliamentary elections. You mentioned other institutions, but what about the EU Commission specifically? So what will the next college look like? And can this election influence who sits there?
Well, it can. Obviously, the governments, propose their candidates to become commissioners, but the parliament's very good at vetoing the ones they don't like. And in the past, we've seen that the first candidates proposed by governments have fallen. I think we had 6 that fell at the last round of hearings in the European Parliament. That'll be the same again. If groups can get themselves organized, they can make sure they're prepared for those hearings, ask the very difficult questions to Commission candidates, it is very easy to take some of those candidates down. So I think that governments already have to have kind of reserves in place. They have to have second choices and third choices in place. The Commission often hopes to get these things done very quickly. That isn't the case, though. I can imagine that the hearings will make a few of those candidates fall. We'll have a second round of those at the end of the year. Potentially that means it passes then and we have a new Commission at the end of the year. But let's see. It'll be more difficult this time than it's ever been before, I think.
Thank you so much, James. Please welcome Scarlett Karoleva, journalist at Riks Europe, in the studio with me. Thank you so much, Scarlett, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So Geert Wilders' PVV has made history in November, giving hope to the sovereignist right all over Europe. Yet Wilders hasn't been able to form a government yet. So how does this situation affect voter preferences?
Well, to start with, I think you formulated it right. He hasn't been able to form a government yet, but today there has been some progress. Apparently, the 4 parties that are forming a government found a consensus on the financial part, which was the most difficult aspect. And if we look at the polls, it shows that Wilders is actually growing in popularity, because if we would have now elections, he would have 50 seats over 37. So it shows that people are clearly fed up with the current status quo, because I think that is the whole explanation why Geert Wilders initially got so many popular votes. Is that because we have been having a liberal government for the past decade, longer than a decade. And what did it bring us? It brought us a migration crisis, a housing crisis, an energy crisis. People are struggling with paying utilities, and people are like, we need change. Enough is enough. And we see that this sentiment is also reflected throughout the rest of Europe. If we look at the statistics, at the polls, the Conservatives will win likely in over 9 states, including Austria, the Netherlands, France, Poland, because we need change. It's that simple. If we look at what the 5 past years of the liberal European Parliament has brought us, it's another migration crisis. It's 15 million people living in energy poverty. It's over 20% of the Europeans that are on the verge of poverty and social inclusion. We're talking about 95 million people that are living now in poverty because we had a liberal government. So something needs to change, and I think it's going to reflect in the upcoming elections.
You were also at NetCon Brussels, and you talked to most of the speakers, including politicians. So what was your sense about the expectations for June?
Yeah, to start with, I saw that you also organized it, and I wanted to give my compliments for that because you were really challenged, but you defeated the limitation of the freedom of speech. And I think we can go back to 3 pillars that we saw reflected in NetCon. First of all, and the strongest sentiment is that we need to go back to the nation state. We need to go back to the state where the governments or the national governments are having the sovereignty, because we're dealing currently with an ever closer union, which was always the plan of the European Union. So they're currently trying to change the treaties, which is stating that countries are having their own veto, and they actually want to have countries getting rid of the veto. So that means more power and more sovereignty to Brussels. You can have a good connection between government and people if everything is just going to be on a supranational level, which is currently happening. So we need to prevent that an ever closer union is getting even closer. Secondly, what we see is that we need to have stricter migration policies. Of course, people that are coming here because they're fleeing from war, they should find shelter and safety within the European borders. But the majority that come in Europe don't seek shelter. We're dealing with illegal migration. And if you look at statistics, 7 out of 10 countries are saying that we're hosting more migrants than we can actually host. So there's a huge call and urge to have stricter borders policies. And I think the third one is more of a cultural war that we're facing at the moment, is that people are fed up with the whole woke agenda that's being pushed on them.
The rainbow flags are just great in the background.
You see throughout the city. And I think to give a clear example, in March of this year, Ireland got to actually host a referendum on whether they wanted to have constitutional changes of the words mother and family. And they overwhelmingly said no. So it clearly shows that people don't want this woke agenda. They don't want it. And I think Europe should respect it. And I think it's going to become very obvious and sane in the upcoming elections.
As I said in the beginning, it does matter who represents you in the European Parliament. We need people, parties and candidates who stand for national sovereignty and democracy,
Yes.
as you said. So use your vote accordingly.
I totally agree.
So as a journalist at Riks Europe, what would you consider to be the greatest scandal of the past 5 years in the European Parliament? And how, if at all, do you think it could affect the outcome of this election?
I love this question because there are so many scandals that we can discuss. I can talk about it for hours and hours, because if people think politics are boring, I'm like, no, just look what's happening within the European Parliament, and then House of Cards is nothing compared to it. It's even much worse. Where should we begin with? Maybe Qatargate. Maybe with the fact that we had a vice president who was bribed by Qatar, Morocco, Mauritius, just to push some very favorable agendas for Qatar. They found 150,000 euro cash in her apartment. They found 600,000 euro cash in the hotel room of her father. Of course, she's cleared now and everything is allegedly, but I mean, I leave it up to the viewer to conclude their own conclusions. Then, of course, we had Pfizergate. I think this one is actually maybe the most biggest scandal, is that we had an unelected president of the European Commission that thought that she was entitled to close deals with the CEO of Pfizer that costed over 43 billion euros. We're talking about tax money. 43 billion euros that's being paid by the European citizens. Most of those, over 4 billion of these vaccines were not even used, and we don't even know what was in those texts because they were deleted. I mean, it doesn't get more undemocratic than that. So I hope that when people go to the ballot and vote, they keep this in mind.
Thank you so much, Scarlett. Thank you so much, Patricia.
Okay.
Patricia is the head of office of the El Debates, a Spanish news outlets Brussels office. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Sophie, for the invitation.
Spain had quite a turbulent year. Millions were protesting on the streets. The socialist government's amnesty law for months, seemingly with no effect. But do you see this anti-government frustration carry on to manifest in the EU elections, or do other issues dominate the campaign?
I don't think there's any other issue than this. This is quite enough for us. It began with the amnesty law, but there are coming up several corruption issues around the president, his relatives, and his close net of collaborators. So the Spanish society is increasingly more indignant, and they want to ask for responsibilities, legal and political responsibilities. And we have just had the Catalan elections. So I think the people people are wanting to be given the opportunity to express their feelings and their the sensation of being completely ignored. So on the part of the president. So I guess that this is the whole point in European elections.
Voters, generally speaking, voters seem to be abandoned center-right establishment parties in the EPP all across the continent. Not so much in Spain, though. So what's the secret of PP, and why is Vox trailing so much behind?
Yeah. I think that it's a sort of kind fight, absurd one, among people who should should do an effort to understand each other. The Popular Party has seen Vox as a section of former voters, and it is not exactly like that. Many people have recovered their hope in politics thanks to Vox, and they have begun voting. For instance, in the Catalan elections, Vox has maintained their candidates, the same number, 11 members of the parliament, whereas the PP has increased a lot. So you can see that they are different people. Same with the Basque elections. Then you have the same Vox element, and then you have other numbers for the PP. So it's true that maybe some people were voting PP because they didn't have any other possibility. But now, if I were PP, I would see Vox as an ally rather than as an enemy. And we have witnessed with shame how in the Basque elections, a member of the Popular Party were telling the press that the campaign was all about defeating Vox. Then, come on, you are in the Basque country, you have the elections. You don't have to focus on an illusionary enemy because it does not exist. So the point is, I guess that Spain is an exception. Spain is different again. And we have this problem. I mean, we can see how the left swallows all their prejudices and they can tolerate each other perfectly and they join forces to govern. And I don't say that we have the same motto, but they say we need to agree on whatever terms before the right takes the power. So,
as you mentioned, there's just been a parliamentary election in Catalonia a few days ago. Mm-hmm. I know that Catalonia is just a different story, a separate issue, but are there any lessons to draw from these results for the upcoming election?
In my view, the main lesson is that nationalism and independentism has lost the elections. I mean, putting apart Sanchez, which is an element, I would say, a window with so many possibilities that if we put apart Sanchez and we consider PSOE, PP and Vox, if you add up the numbers, you have majority, a large majority upon the nationalist and separatist votes. For me, that's the lesson. And that's the calling of the people, and that's what politicians should listen to. Otherwise, they will be just trying to resurrect a ghost like right and left. We all know here in the European Union that PP and PSOE vote together. So what is this theater in Spain and with so many stakes? So that's the lesson.
Thanks so much, Patricia. My next guest is Tamás Orbán, my colleague, journalist of the European Conservative based in Brussels. Thank you, Tamás, for joining me. As a journalist in the EU bubble, what themes do you see dominating this year's campaign?
First of all, the most visible thing is that there's a general panic among the establishment parties. They are so afraid of this so-called right-wing surge that Brussels is starting to resemble to a US-style two-party system. On one side, you've got the Conservatives, the Sovereignist parties, ECR, ID, and on the other side, you've got everybody else, all the leftist parties and the EPP. Basically, there's one of the narratives that they are using is to try to portray the right, the Conservatives, as some kind of violent right-wing extremists after last week's attack on a socialist German politician that they are now using to sort of blanket condemn the entire conservative movement, even though I might add that AfD politicians are the most likely to be attacked in Germany, and an AfD politician is attacked every week in the country, but nobody is talking about that. So in Brussels, the left is using this attack to sort of force the EPP into promising not to work together, not to collaborate with anybody right of them, which the EPP has refused to do so because they may seem arrogant sometimes, but they are not stupid. They see the numbers, they see what's going to happen, and they know that they might need a few allies, especially from ECR, and I'm thinking of Giorgia Meloni's Fratelli d'Italia. But there's already a rift in the mainstream party coalition. And the other narrative is that for some reason, and the other narrative is this completely unfounded claim that for some reason all of the conservative parties are supposed to be some kind of Russian proxies, and therefore, by default, the enemies of democracy. Now, this is especially funny because in Brussels, when we see political censorship, that's almost always against the conservatives. Now you can think of what happened a few weeks ago at NatCon, when one of the mayors tried to shut down Europe's largest conservative conference, or the announcement just from a few days ago when the EBU, European Broadcasting Union, they also organized Eurovision, they announced that they are going to exclude both conservative parties from the final EU election debate. So at the debate, you're going to have the far left, the Greens, the Socialists, the Liberals, the EPP, and no real opposition figures. So basically, the main takeaway is that the mainstream establishment parties, the Orthodox Coalition, Renew, S&D, EPP, they see that there is a shift in the balance of power, and they don't really know how to address it. There's a chaos, and they are even turning against each other.
As one of the main contributors to the European Conservatives' Guide to the 2024 EU elections, the stakes, what would you say? Why should people read this special edition?
Well, because there's really nothing else on the market like the stakes. I mean, and that's because that in Brussels, even more so than in politics, media is completely dominated by the left. If conservative people around Europe want to read about issues that they think are important, they can find it in the stakes, and only in the stakes in English, if they want print magazines related to the elections. But if anyone wants to just get a grasp of alternative opinions or arguments on the other side of the EU, really there's nothing else about this in this election cycle out there. And we designed the whole magazine to be a handy guidebook, a handbook, not only to the election, but also to explain the EU itself. So we have explainers to the EU institutions, we have colorful party profiles and separate segments for the larger countries. There's a lot of graphs and charts, images. It's there because we feel that the EU, many times it's too opaque, it's too complicated, sometimes pretty much on purpose. So we'd like to introduce a bit of transparency into the game so that everybody who would be interested in the EU elections now can learn why it is really important and why should they go out and use their vote.
Thank you so much, Tamás. If you want to learn more about the battle for the future of Europe, purchase our special edition, The Stakes, in our webshop, and also check out our website for our EU 2024 landing page to learn what's at stake. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned because we'll be back on the 9th of June reporting live from Brussels on the EU elections.